Tonight on The Political Game, we explain that complicated concept called the separation of powers. It's the principle that makes democracy work. We'll talk to the Queen's main man in Aotearoa on the eve of his stepping down from the Governor-General's office.
Normally it involves picking up a pen and signing my name and dating it.
And we'll discover how a century and a half of history, a disastrous fire and an anticipated earthquake have all combined to leave us with a discordant architectural jumble of buildings in the parliamentary precinct. If you ask a cynic, they might say Parliament is what you vote for, but government is what you get. And that's probably true, but far too simplistic to define our democratic system.
This is the House of Representatives, not the House of people who all vote national, and it's really important to understand that. And that robustness and richness of our democracy actually serves us as a country very well.
To maintain a true democracy, power cannot be concentrated entirely in one place. In New Zealand's democratic system, there are four separate but powerful forces in play. The first is us, the voters, who decide every 3 years which politicians we want to represent us in Parliament. It's the Parliament which makes our laws. The numerically dominant group of politicians in the House who can combine to form a government administers the law and runs the country. And the Crown, the Queen, represented by the Governor-General, who is our symbolic head of state. It is the Queen's man who gets to swear in the Prime Minister and his ministers and finally sign off on the legislation which is passed by Parliament before it can become law.
Normally it involves picking up a pen and signing my name and dating it. And dating it is important because it becomes law on the date that is on the document. That's the signing part of it. The interesting part before that, and what I have to be assured of, is that the bill has the confidence of the House. So the majority of the House have passed it. And so there are a number of signatures that I look to in the covering documents to show me that that is the case. Equally, the document comes through a process and through a series of hands that give me assurance that it is legal in the sense that it's not breaking the law or seeking to break the law, but also that it has the proper constitutional arrangements that support it.
In our Parliament, of 121 members where the government must have a majority willing to support its legislation, the magic number is 61 or more votes. Many people confuse government and Parliament.
Parliament.
I don't even know.
I don't know, a place where they make laws.
They are separate but dependent bodies. It's a fact that's easier to understand in New Zealand than in most other democracies, as the official parliamentary historian John Martin explains.
People inside Parliament get infuriated because they say, no, you've got to understand the distinction between Parliament and government. That's where the government works. Parliament works in Parliament House just over here. Don't forget it. But no one remembers that, no one takes any notice. And it's always the beehive which is in the public mind.
When you take that bird's eye view, it becomes easier to see. The beehive is where the Prime Minister and his ministers mainly work. It's the headquarters of the government. The main Parliament, next door, is where the members of Parliament do much of their work, slugging it out in the debating chamber at question time, other times working more cooperatively in select committees.
So we've got quite a few issues this week, and I'll just start as usual with the upcoming business for the week.
The man who makes sure everything that eventually gets before the Governor-General is legal and above board is the Clerk of the House. In David Wilson's title, the humble English word clerk is totally at odds with his very powerful role.
So business for this week, so we start following my meeting with the Leader of the House this morning. Tuesday, they do the second reading of the Appropriation, Confirmation and Validation Bill.
As the Chief Executive of the Office of the Clerk, he controls a staff of about 100 who vet every bill through every stage of the process. They make sure that what's proposed is legal. His staff advises and supports the select committees and individual members. David Wilson is the official keeper of parliamentary records, which detail how and why decisions were made. His staff also spreads news and information about Parliament through the official website, webcasts, Twitter and Facebook, and the telecasts of Parliament.
The job of Clerk of the House is quite a varied one. The most visible parts of it are sitting in the chamber and advising the Speaker and members, taking votes and making announcements in the House.
Report of the Social Services Committee on the Public Collections and Solicitations Disclosure of Payment Bill.
Then we move on to oral questions, which I guess is probably the most exciting part of the day. In that, I'm really just listening to all of the questions and answers, and they're available to help the Speaker, particularly in ruling on points of order that might be raised.
The House comes to questions for oral answer. Question number 1, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr. Speaker, this question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by all his statements? Sorry, does he still stand by? Well, it's so obvious.
Order. Order. Order.
The still being the operative word. Does he still stand by all his statements? If so, why?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, because I find them more accurate and more coherent than the members' questions.
The Clerk of the House is the Speaker's right-hand man and closest advisor.
It needs to be a close relationship of trust, but it's also one where the Clerk has some independence. The Clerk isn't employed by the Speaker, and in terms of giving advice about procedure of the House isn't answerable to the Speaker either. So my job is to give the advice I think that's right and can be sustained in the House, whether or not everybody agrees with it.
The Clerk of the House and his staff make sure that the 12 oral questions allowed in each question time are proper, factual and pertinent. As well, the questions must be directed to the Government Minister responsible for the matter in question. To work over the questions, David Wilson calls on the services of his Deputy Clerk, Rafael González Montero.
Questions, for example, need to be factual and not have opinions. So nobody could ask, how are you going to improve the wonderful economy going forward? Well, you can't say wonderful, that's an opinion. Just the same as the opposition couldn't ask, what do you think about the awful state of the economy? So that's the things we check for. So I'll now check with Alison. She will tell me how we did with the questions and...
So they were excellent. We couldn't find any mistakes.
100%?
Well, I just have one little nice to have.
Okay.
Otherwise, they were 100%, and
Okay.
this is just a nice to have. So see here, 50-50 chance.
Yeah.
So that, as that's like a ratio, we'd probably go 50:50 rather than 50-50.
Okay.
But that's up to you. So
Yeah.
that's not a mistake. It's 100%.
No. I
in
think
here. This is just a.
I think as
tweak.
long as because it
Easier to
doesn't
read.
doesn't change the way they read it. So
Not
I
at
think
all.
we'll support that. We'll say
Okay.
yes.
Lovely.
You know, sometimes it's quite high pressure because sometimes people come towards the end just before, for example, at 10:20. So you need to move through it very quickly, and sometimes you will miss something, but generally it's not the case. Generally, it goes as smooth as you've seen it go today, although it's not. They haven't been published, so anything can happen until about 11:30, and that's where we wait. It is very exciting. I mean, when you think about it, when I do this part of the job, is great because I get to see the questions that are going to be asked in the afternoon. But for the officials, I'm the first person to see them. So that's very exciting, and it keeps you on your toes. It makes you be informed about what happens outside so that you can look into the issues and make sure that the questions are in order. Although you may think that every day is the same, every day is not the same, and every day has just some little spice added to it. So it's very, very cool. I think it's in the job description, just keep calm and carry on.
The House comes to questions for oral answer. Question number 1 in the name of James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, on what dates did he discuss with the Minister of Revenue his conversation with Ken Whitney on foreign trusts, and what specifically did he say to the Minister?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there's no record of when I spoke to the Minister of Revenue, but it would have been between the 27th of November 2014 when the Herald story first appeared. And the
purpose of question time is to hold ministers to account for the work of the government. And so ministers really need to be asked about things they're responsible for as ministers, not as members of a political party or leaders of a political party or as constituency MPs, for example. So there are some rules there to make sure that the questions focus on things that the minister should be able to answer. Then there are, I think, some rules to ensure that to ensure fairness to the person asking the question as well, that there's an expectation they will have the question addressed and they will get some sort of reasonable answer.
Did he tell the Revenue Minister to expedite his meeting with the foreign trust industry?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is he...
People often ask, what does it cost to run Parliament? In other words, what is the price of democracy in New Zealand? The latest figures for 12 months to June of 2015 show that we, the taxpayers, pay just a fraction less than $178 million. That means the price of democracy is about $40 a year for every man, woman and child in New Zealand. Look at Parliament and all it does, and that's value for money. As thousands of commuters stream past the Parliament complex each day, few spare much thought to what's happening on the hill across the road. Many of them, though, might pause and wonder how the odd, ill-assorted and eclectic mix of buildings that comprise the Parliament came to be here. It's fair to say that a series of accidents rather than a master plan or grand design was responsible. In his official history of the Parliament, John Martin tells the story.
New Zealand has a unique set of 3 parliamentary buildings coming out of 3 different styles at 3 completely different periods. Well, the Parliamentary Library building began in the late 1890s, although it was a little bit truncated at the top because the Premier Seddon ran into trouble with his fellow parliamentarians. He'd actually basically committed the money without Parliament approving it. So they had to trim back the expenditure on it, but he got pretty much what he wanted, which was a rather magnificent Gothic revival structure, complete with beautiful stained glass work and interior gilt plaster work that we can still see today. I mean, today it's like a living museum, if you like. It's a lovely building of that particular period. Seddon's idea was to make it magnificent. Not only did they build it as a library building, but they also built it as the equivalent of today's beehive, as the place where the executive government, including Premier Seddon himself, would work. So the steps that you see there are in fact were the main steps, the main entranceway into Parliament buildings. So it was a very important building for the parliamentary complex. This is just magnificent really, and it conveys the sort of atmosphere that the old MPs would have experienced back in the day more than 100 years ago when they assembled in this room. And they would order up some liquor from Bellamy's or a cup of tea perhaps even, you know, depending on the way they felt. And they'd sit down here around the fire and they'd talk over the events of the day. So this, at that time, we're talking about more than 100 years ago, was the absolute centre of parliamentary life. The 19th century buildings which preceded it on the same site were built of wood and had dried out over the decades and were considered a really serious fire risk. Less than 10 years after it had been built, Parliament experienced the most catastrophic fire that has ever occurred here in 1907.
The night watchman's attention was attracted by a crackling noise coming from the interpreter's room about halfway between the chamber of the House of Representatives and the Legislative Council. The flames lit up most of Wellington, and very soon spectators gathered from all directions. It was apparent that the main building could not be saved, and everyone then concentrated on salvaging what they could.
And the design of that building did its job. They had lowered an iron fire door overnight, and when the fire started in the early hours of the morning, while it swept through the rest of the wooden buildings that still existed just behind the library building, and completely destroyed them. The library was preserved intact.
Of the old parliamentary building today, there remains no trace, save for these ironic relics. 3 Victorian porcelain urinals still stand sentinel behind the library building.
The parliamentarians had to think about, well, we need a new building now in 1907, and a design competition was created. A new neo-classical Edwardian style of building was designed. This was actually going to be twice as big as what you can see now. So we have the main entrance stairway, which was designed to be at the centre of the building, actually on the south end of the building. Originally, Parliament House actually had cupola on top, which was again part of the traditional sort of design work associated with that neoclassical structure, but the government was penny pinching, and we've ended up with the sort of half the curate's egg that we have today. The First World War did have an effect on the construction of Parliament House. They had lots of shortages of steel. They couldn't find enough men to actually build the thing because everyone was going off to war. If you look at the outside, the facade of the building, the lower level is actually granite from the Coromandel, and the upper levels are marble from near Takaka in the South Island. And that in itself was a hell of a job to get the marble across Cook Strait on scows during the First World War. I think one actually sank, and they couldn't extract enough marble from the quarry to keep construction going. So that slowed things down. So that was an epic exercise in its own right.
The main parliamentary building was never completed, but over the years this did not stop the work of Parliament or even the staging of such elaborate events as a royal visit and the ceremonial opening of a new parliament.
100 years ago, when the people of New Zealand gained for themselves the right of responsible self-government, it would have required a prophetic imagination to have foreseen the possibility of the present occasion.
About the same time as the 1954 royal visit, Parliament finally bit the bullet and decided to go ahead with a new building.
It took 30 or 40 years for that to actually be resolved, and it was resolved with a decision that they would not carry on with the second half of the building. Instead, they would build a structure alongside it, which was in complete contrast to Parliament House itself. We had Parliament House built and functioning by the 1920s, and then there was a long period where nothing much happened, and they just couldn't seem to solve the problem. Building the second half of Parliament House was going to be a pretty expensive exercise, and it wasn't going to be necessarily structurally the best given the earthquake-prone nature of Wellington, and people were becoming increasingly conscious of the need to build structures that could resist earthquakes. So it became an intractable problem the politicians just couldn't really solve. In the end, in the early 60s, someone had the bright idea to call in an outside, world-renowned, eminent architect to provide a viewpoint on this matter. Sir Basil Spence, an international architect, was brought in from Britain essentially to solve the issue for New Zealand. So one possibility was to knock everything down and start again with a completely new structure. Adding the second half onto Parliament House didn't appeal either, and the middle option, building a completely new building, was decided upon, and that was decided upon effectively on the basis of a little sketch which Sir Basil Spence did kind of on the back of an envelope, but which captured the imagination of Prime Minister Keith Holyoake and other key politicians at the time.
The name and the basic shape came from a packet of beehive matches in the architect's pocket, and despite official misgivings, it stuck.
The concept of the beehive was in that fashion born, and it grabbed the imagination. Here was New Zealand at the forefront of modernist architecture, doing something different, doing something which would attract international attention. probably something that politicians had not considered at all in terms of their own ways of looking at it. But someone coming in from outside had produced this completely new idea, and it was an idea which took off. There were a lot of challenges in translating that sketch into a workable building, and that task was largely left to the Ministry of Works here in Wellington. And they had to work really hard to affect that translation on the ground and to produce a building which was actually practical and workable. The Beehive is certainly a national iconic statement. Whether one likes it or not, one has to see it in its landscape, and it's definitely there. It attracts attention, and it is probably one of the most recognisable buildings in New Zealand even today, just as it was when it first appeared like some sort of growing mushroom in the 1970s. And it makes just as much impact today, and it has become such a statement that whenever anyone thinks of Parliament, they associate it with the Beehive instead of that rather squat building next door, Parliament House. But that's just the way things are, and you have to accept that. I mean, I think that as a building making a statement, that also makes a contribution in the sense of the public's awareness of what happens down here in Wellington, and that's all to the good.
The Beehive was designed to withstand earthquakes, but the fragility of the Parliament and the library buildings led to a very expensive fix being applied. The radical solution was to detach both buildings from their foundations and to insert a series of shock absorbers or buffers which are designed to absorb severe tectonic shocks.
Base isolators have been designed to move 350 millimetres, which is, 14 inches each way.
At the same time, the internal load-bearing beams and trusses were replaced or reinforced to ensure the structural integrity of these historic buildings. Reinforced concrete beams were inserted into selected areas to prevent any twisting movements during an earthquake. The most recent test of Parliament shock absorbers was the Seddon earthquake in Cook Strait on the 5th of July 2013, 6.5 on the Richter scale, which rocked central Wellington.
During the Seddon earthquake, this building moved about 20 millimetres or 3/4 of an inch. So it just gives you an idea of how much seismic ability this building has. We've put in a seismic reader here, which is a bit Heath Robinson, but it works very well. That's the little instrument that recorded the 3/4 of an inch or the 20 millimetre movement last year.
The engineers and the geotech experts reckon it will remain standing, shaken but intact, when the big one eventually comes.
Parliament House is seismically braced, and so is the library. The Beehive sits on a huge concrete slab, which is massive, so that just moves. And you may ask, why do we do that for Parliament? Why don't you just let it get wrecked or damaged and then maybe build another one? Well, this is the centre of power for New Zealand, so this has to carry on for government. So that's why we've gone to a lot of expense to do this.
With its 4 subterranean levels and 10 stories above ground, Basil Spencer's Faulty Tower is an undeniably iconic architectural statement. Its beaten copper roof, 72 metres above the streets, is an outstanding landmark on Wellington's skyline. But that said, the radical design of the Beehive has provided its share of headaches for the maintenance crews and complaints from those who work in it.
The Beehive was a very impractical building to work in. It was designed as a circular building, and this made it really difficult in terms of the office space, which was wedge-shaped. Every office was a wedge, and towards the windows it had these terrible ledges which were covered in ghastly brown carpet. And the office tapered towards the centre of the building, the so-called core of the building, in which there were a series of small lifts in a circle, all of them far too small. And when you got out of a lift and into one of the central foyers in the core, you would spin around in a circle and you wouldn't know which direction you were going to head off. And while there was a numbering system, it was just no good. And it wasn't until quite recently, when they refurbished the Beehive, that they actually put some sort of indicator in of direction. Bellamy's, in the early days, had a terrible job trying to cope with the scattered facilities which were provided in terms of the restaurants and the bars and so on for MPs. So, all up, it was not a practical building.
With the Beehive built of reinforced concrete and structural steel, and the two older buildings insulated and strengthened, the parliamentary precinct might be the safest place in Wellington when the big one comes. So, whatever the architectural shortcomings may be, it is certainly in good shape to be the home of democracy for another century or more.
Next time on The Political Game, we visit the only part of Parliament not controlled by the Speaker. It's a special place set aside for Māori.